Breaking down the AFC playoff picture and looking at the FFPC Playoff Challenge and talking through the scenarios we think may play out, what could play out, maybe what some of the contrarian plays would be, and how to build out a team from the AFC side of things. We did talk about the NFC on the Monday edition of the podcast, so these two are kind of paired listening. If you haven't had a chance to check out that one, please do so. Shawn, something we don't tend to mention on the podcast that we should do from time to time is you can leave us a written review on your favorite podcast app. They always help. So if you're going back and checking out that Monday episode, drop us a nice comment, drop us a review. They always help, and we enjoy to read those out as well. The NFC, Shawn, was certainly interesting. The AFC is also a very interesting picture. We get the Broncos advancing with a big performance from Bo Nix. Obviously not a huge amount of resistance from the Chiefs in that one, but still, as a rookie, a very impressive performance to put up at this point of the season to get yourself into the playoffs. That's following up from a performance against the Bengals the week previously that was very interesting. We'll talk about some of the names for the Broncos that could be interesting plays. We get Marvin Mims with another 2-touchdown game as he comes on strong down the end of the season. But they will face a tough contest against the Buffalo Bills. We get the Steelers facing against the Ravens. We also get the Chargers and the Texans. And that's how it is all going to set up for the wild card round this coming weekend. A couple of these games, Shawn, that I think, could end up being quite one-sided, and that would be in the kind of favorite teams that are on the AFC side, and the Bills and the Ravens. I think they could come out quite strong. But we've seen some interesting play from Knicks, as I mentioned, so maybe they do put up a little bit more of a challenge of resistance there. The game that I think could potentially go either way this weekend being the Chargers and the Texans. It is always, a couple of surprises will be sprinkled in there over the course of the weekend, but we do get the Chargers as 2.5-point favorites this weekend. We get 8.5 points to the Ravens being favored, and then we get 8 points to the Buffalo Bills. And, the highest total on the AFC side being 47.5, a little bit higher across the NFC in terms of the totals for this weekend. How are you looking at the AFC side of things? Is it as entertaining? Are you looking forward to it as much to see what happens this weekend? Or do you think the NFC playoff games maybe have that little bit more of an interesting angle?
I think you've got to be fired up for these games. You look at that Buffalo Denver game to start, and the Bills have given up so many points in a couple of different situations recently that, with Sean Payton absolutely on fire as a play caller, you would expect the Broncos to score. And then it's an interesting question of whether that borderline elite defense, one that created a huge number of sacks this season, what happens when they have Josh Allen in the backfield under duress? Is he able to avoid sacks, hit the deep pass the way he has for the entire course of the year? Or are they able to actually get him on the ground, force some punts? You think back to that Bills-Chiefs game, and the Chiefs constantly had the Bills in 3rd and long, and then Josh Allen would pick it up over and over and over. He leads them to a big victory in that one. But the Bills aren't impregnable. They're not perfect, right? They did get blown out in week 4 by the Baltimore Ravens. They lost to the Texans before the Texans had become really not even a legitimate playoff team, much less an elite team. The Texans were playing better at that point of the season. They started off the year, barely defeating the Arizona Cardinals. They had the back-to-back games where they gave up 44 and 42 points to Detroit. So many of their victories are in games against teams with either no quarterback play or quarterbacks who are injured. You look at this little 3-game stretch to finish the season, and they play the Patriots twice. They obviously have 2 games against the Jets. They have games in there against the Jaguars and Titans. This is a team that looks like it's had a 4th-place schedule, in part because the AFC East ended up being a lot worse than we were expecting And then the AFC South was just as bad as we were expecting, if not even somehow worse than that. What does that mean once we get out into the playoffs? That's still to be seen. We know that teams like the Chargers and the Broncos were very successful against bad teams. They were completely unsuccessful against good teams. You certainly can't give the Broncos too much credit for their win against Kansas City, other than to say that the Chiefs' deep backups did not look particularly good. The Chiefs do seem like they're built very much around Patrick Mahomes and those handful of elite defenders. You would not want Carson Wentz to go out there for a moment in the playoffs, or at the very least, you wouldn't want him to go out with the receiving group that he was given against Denver. Such a stark contrast between their performance and, for example, the performances of the Commanders and the Rams when they had some players also on the bench. Colm, I think that that's the game that really jumps out as being the provocative contest that could go against expectation as we go into the first week of the playoffs here. I would expect to get an easy Ravens victory over the Steelers. I would expect to see a somewhat easy Chargers victory over the Texans. The Texans and the Steelers do appear to be the two very easiest fades in the entire playoff contest. Now, having said that, Colm, looking back here at the Texans versus the Chargers, we know that the Chargers have mostly beaten up on bad teams. That was, again, what happened in week 18 as they secure the number 5 seed by virtue of defeating the Raiders. And they do give up meaningful receiving lines in that game to both Jacoby Myers and Brock Bowers. Do you like the Texans' chances a little bit more than maybe the recent results suggest? The Chargers are a team that you can fade if you like them to lose. We get the monster game from Quentin Johnston here. We have been joking throughout the offseason that this was the type of game he had against Michigan in the college football playoffs to eliminate Michigan, that was going to be something in the back of Harbaugh's mind, and he probably was a little bit more of a believer than the people who'd actually been in practice with Johnston the previous year. This Texans-Chargers game could be fascinating.
Yeah, Shawn, usually, I don't watch any of the games that I haven't, or don't check the box score. I watch the games and then see, how it plays out rather than going in and looking at the box score. But because this was week 18, I watched like the majority of the early games, and then this was one of the later games here. So I got up, I had seen I think I had seen like quarter and a half at this point, but go into the box score and I see 13 receptions for 186 yards. And I actually did like a blink. I was like, is my eyes deceiving me with how this one went? So he was heavily involved and had a really strong performance here. There was a couple of performances this week that made me feel that way, where I'm like, whoa, that's a little bit interesting. On the other side of that game, Jacoby Myers had another big game. He had 123 yards and a TD. But I think, Shawn, that the Texans are, they're beat up. They have players missing, and they also have players who are underperforming. And I think that they are going to be overmatched here in this one. We've talked quite a few times on the show about Herbert and how he has played over certain stretches of games and then sometimes now putting it together for entire games. But I think that the Chargers are going to be set up here to convincingly, I think, see off the Texans and this week's game. So I would be of the mind that you mentioned, I believe you said it was the Steelers and the Texans being the easiest full fades. They would be the two that I would be leaning towards as full fades as well. And I'm quite convinced that the Chargers will be able to take this one, even though, as I mentioned at the start, the lines aren't massive in terms of the 2.5 points, but it is only a 44.5 point over under, so they are expecting it to be a lower scoring contest overall. I think that in those low scoring contests, I think this Jim Harbaugh led team is in a better shape than the Texans are going to be when it gets into the crunch situation. So I might be a little bit optimistic, Shawn, on the Chargers versus what you're thinking of their chances here, am I?
Well, I think you have to take the Chargers. The Texans do have the better defense. They could go out there and force Justin Herbert into more difficult situations than he has faced through a lot of this season, where they have had a pretty soft schedule. You have Nico Collins. He's always someone who makes for an interesting play if you think the Texans are going to lose, but lose in a shootout because the Chargers defense is pretty exploitable. One of the things that you notice,
we are getting down to the point though that like it's Nico Collins and nothing else,
which can be good, right? Which can be good. And I think that they're going to be so heavily faded that he ends up being an opportunity to roster a guy who would play in one game, then be out, have, you know, a 35-point game, be the player that you had to have with an interesting mix the rest of the way. And with Collins, that's probably a little bit of a unique situation in that most years they're going to be at least favored to win this particular game. Maybe that's not the case. I mean, they look bad, right? There's no guarantee that the Texans will make the playoffs next year, but it's always worth noting when you can get a star at a discount and diversify in some other way. I think that's something you want to keep in mind here. By contrast, when you look at the Pittsburgh Steelers versus the Baltimore Ravens, there's no one on that Steelers team that is interesting in any way. And that probably includes their superstar kicker, Chris Boswell, in part because you would expect them to be blown out so early that if the Steelers are making any real attempt to act competitive in this game, they're going to have to go for it in situations that would be pretty uncomfortable for them for most of the year.
Colm, you never know, Shawn, they may get like a deep pass attempt by Russell Wilson that gets an early pass interference call that then they go 3 and out and can get an early field goal.
Yeah, you get the early field goal, but that doesn't really do it for you still. The thing that was so surprising about their Week 18 loss to the Bengals was just how few of those gorgeous sideline passes it featured. We talk continuously about Russell Wilson and how that's the only pass he can throw. Now, you do get the dagger to end the game where you get the drop from Pat Freiermuth. Probably if that pass is completed, it doesn't do anything for them anyway when you consider what the field position and time on the clock was. But mostly for Russell Wilson, if you're not getting 4 or 5 of those sideline bombs, then the stats for both him and for his receivers are going to be terrible. You're not going to get the drops necessarily that George Pickens had in that game every time, but weather will be a factor for those receivers and making the difficult catches. That's one of the reasons that as we kind of look through these games, you're going to want to keep an eye on what the weather is. You're going to want to keep an eye on which games are being played outdoors in the elements versus the games that have a better situation with the domes. Just generally speaking, the NFC side is going to have an easier time of it from that perspective. The Chiefs, the Bills, the Ravens, all teams that are going to be playing and hosting out there in the elements. Colm, looking at that Ravens team, you have Lamar Jackson, who is the ultimate unicorn. You have Derrick Henry, who in any given game could go for 200 yards and 3 touchdowns. If you're picking a Ravens relatively early exit, maybe a Ravens exit against the Bills, Derrick Henry becomes a little bit interesting. We talked on the NFC show that tight end is a little bit of a difficult position to fill. I think especially if there are concerns with Zay Flowers, then you might finally get Mark Andrews with some target volume in addition to having this touchdown upside. So Andrews, despite barely being targeted all season, if he had an 8 or 9 target game with 2 touchdowns, I don't think that in the current moment would be as surprising as it would have been through a big chunk of the season. But so much of this and so much of your Ravens decision probably comes down to not the Steelers game, but what you think is going to happen against the Buffalo Bills in round 2, Lamar Jackson versus Josh Allen. Those are going to be the 2 guys that are rostered on the most teams at QB. Who do you like to win the AFC playoffs? How do you see this developing? Certainly, it would appear that Jackson and Allen are not only going to have an additional game over players on the Kansas City Chiefs, but that semifinal game in so many ways determines everything, as a huge number of participants are going to simply be sort of default picking the winner of that game to upset / defeat the Kansas City Chiefs and finally get to the Super Bowl. Bills Ravens. Who do you like?
Yeah, so just to go through it for people, that may not have a screen up in front of them, we do have the situation where if both those teams win, they face each other as the second and third seed. The Chiefs would face the Chargers, and that means that, Shawn's mentioned the semifinals, those facing off. Obviously, the Chiefs will be big favorites versus the Chargers, and then Shawn mentioning that the hope of the nation, Shawn, it may be. Shawn didn't take too kindly to the Chiefs being the kind of the bad guys this season, but they are the dynasty at the moment as they continue to roll on. But before we go into that, to mention the overall reason is we're talking through which quarterbacks, which players on the roster for that FFPC challenge. You do just get to pick one player on each roster, 12 total players, including a kicker and a defense. So you're looking at probably avoiding the Steelers completely in this situation. There's two teams you're going to have to do that with. Then you have the soft fades where you're picking a kicker or a defense from, and then you're setting out your roster the other way with double points in the Super Bowl. So if you get one of these wild card teams like a Lamar Jackson or a Josh Allen, you get them then to get to play the Chiefs, advance to the Super Bowl. You get double points in the Super Bowl. You're essentially getting those games plus the extra points in the Super Bowl, whereas we're looking at the Chiefs, it would just be hoping that they get to or the Lions, who we talked about on the previous show, get into the Super Bowl to get those double points to kind of match things up. I feel out of these teams, the team probably with the most overall talent and offense is the Baltimore Ravens. The team that I just feel that will end up winning that game when they face off is the Buffalo Bills. There's something about Josh Allen that is hard to fully quantify, but in those situations with what they're doing with the team, both, the defense has had its troubles, but then some key spots does step up in those areas. I think that we'll see the Bills. And I think we're destined, Shawn, for a Bills versus Kansas City Chiefs conference championship, and the Chiefs get into the championship yet again. But I think that either the Ravens or the Bills, whoever advance, I think that they'll be the team that I'll be taking to face the Lions in the Super Bowl. But you can obviously never bet against your Kansas City Chiefs and how things will play out. But I do think that 2-3 is quite interesting. The other thing that's interesting about it, and we see this in the playoffs every season, is you get those two teams, could be a shootout, very tough physical matchup, and then you're into a situation that the Chiefs have had a relatively comfortable victory versus the 5th seed Chargers. And when you get to the Chiefs versus whichever of those is the team out of the 2-3 seed matchup, struggles to compete with the team that have had the bye week and the relatively easy match. And at this point now, you have kind of 2 bye weeks for the Chiefs, with week 18 and the week coming up here. So they should be in much better shape. You did mention Zay Flowers. He sounds like day to day. That might be just optimistic, from Harbaugh ahead of this game, to try and put out some positive vibes to the fan base and to the organization. But they are facing the Steelers. He may not suit up this week, and then obviously be hoping to get him back for the game versus the Bills, if that is who they go on to face. Mark Andrews is interesting because he does have that upside. There'll be some contrarian plays to go and get Isaiah Likely into the lineup. Their volume from game to game can be, flipped or very similar. Rashad Bateman, I think, again, it's going to be quite contrarian if you're going to Bateman out of the options available, but he is somebody who has got in the end zone and has put up relatively good stats in recent weeks as well. But I think that Lamar Jackson and Josh Allen are going to be the two highest rostered quarterbacks. I don't think it's controversial to say that in this particular contest. And Derrick Henry then will be one of the most rostered running backs. So if we look through the team, I think any of the pass catchers, Shawn, could be a way to get unique. Of course, you can change out Zay Flowers for another Baltimore Raven if he wasn't to go this week, if he was the player you were thinking about playing, as long as you probably do it in the flex spot, because it's unlikely that you're going to swap him out from a structural perspective for Lamar Jackson. But if it was a flex spot, you could go to Derrick Henry or one of the other pass catchers if he didn't go this week and you needed to swap that out. But I think the Ravens are interesting from the options that are available outside of those high kind of leverage players where they're going to be rostered quite strongly. The other team, Shawn, that I want to just jump back to that we didn't really talk about their options, but we talked about the team in general and their chances to win this week, and that is the Chargers themselves. I think that there's a number of players for LA. You talked about the performance that Quentin Johnson had, but Ladd McConkey continues to be very interesting. I don't think a lot of people are going to go the QB route here on this side. J.K. Dobbins has been getting volume, but has the efficiency hasn't always been there. So I feel like on the Charger side, even though they could be one of the winning teams, they're a little bit tricky to decide where that volume goes. I think it'll be McConkey that gets the majority of it. Is there any other angles that you have for the Chargers? Are they somebody where the defense could come into play? You don't really want the defense, going multiple rounds, but kicker or defense outside of McConkey, any other options?
The more that we kind of work through this, the more I'm tempted to go back away from this Chargers team. I think they will be an extremely popular squad to play as the road victor. But once you work through it there, and you do consider that the strengths Houston brings to the table are on the defensive side, they could potentially wipe out this weak Chargers skill position group. McConkey, probably not as much. Everybody else could get taken out. You mentioned that Dobbins had a lot of volume against the Raiders, but doesn't do well from a yards per carry perspective, loses the touchdown to Hassan Haskins. He would be interesting in a loss, but probably not compelling, just generally speaking. If we get such a big move to the Chargers away from the Texans, especially maybe from the more sophisticated players or participants within the contest, then I think going back to Houston, playing Nico Collins, assuming their defense comes through, opting for a little bit of a bounce back. Maybe this most recent week has allowed them to flush a little bit of what's been happening recently. When you look through their schedule, when you think about the virtually impossible nature of playing CJ Stroud in any type of format over the last month to 2 months, it can kind of take you out of that mindset when you realize that they defeated the Buffalo Bills. They lost by 2 to your Packers. They lost by a field goal to the Lions. They're a team that, midway through the season would have been a little bit more interesting. Kind of working back in the direction of thinking that is the play when you think about who the players are that are involved and you think about the matchups. Now, Colm, we'll have a lot more information for everybody later in the week when you look at the passing matchup rate or some of the things that Blair has done, have those breakdowns for you so you can see who the guys are. So head on over to RotoViz to check those out, take advantage of the tools. This is one of my favorite times of the year to use the tools because we have so much information now on the teams, how they deploy their players, who wins in certain matchups, and you can use that specifically to win a contest like the FFPC Playoff contest. Colm, you're picking Bills over Ravens. This one to me is interesting because the Bills and the Ravens have a lot of blowout victories. They also have these weird losses. I think you could make the claim that the Ravens are a lot hotter than the Bills are. And yet when you sort of look through that and why it's the case, like, okay, well, the defensive numbers, for example, this season, the Ravens through most of the year were getting absolutely shredded as a passing defense. And then you read Blair's wrong read from the most recent week, and you discover that they've had a huge bounce back. Well, one of the reasons that that's been the case is that they've played the Giants, Steelers, and Texans heading into that final week contest against the Cleveland Browns. So when you play the Giants, the Steelers, and the Texans, your pass defense is going to start to look a little bit better. When they have played some of the better teams. They struggled with a loss to the Chiefs, a loss to the Eagles.
They also beat Cincinnati twice, but they did give up 38 in one and 34 in the other.
And so you think about the Bengals. The Bengals was the team. I mean, one of the reasons I think, obviously the Chiefs are not going to win that game against Denver yesterday, regardless. But you did get the impression that they wanted there to be a 0% chance that the Cincinnati Bengals
they don't want to see them turning up.
No Bengals in the playoffs. The Bengals probably right there with the Bills and the Ravens at this point, and you wouldn't want to introduce them into the playoff picture as well. That having said, the Ravens defeated the Bills 35-10 when they played them earlier this season. They have a better defense. They have an even more explosive offense. Both of these teams have gone into the playoffs in recent years with a lot of expectations. You had the devastating loss at home in the AFC Championship game last year for the Ravens. They look like now a better squad than that team. I think they've addressed some of the issues in that they can be more balanced. The current offensive coordinator is much more willing to abandon the run than the previous regime. They've built that offense now in such a way that when they do abandon the run, they're more dynamic than they had been in the past. At the same time, they now have Derrick Henry. And so there's going to be a little bit less of that temptation to go away from those guys. I think it's a better offense. Their defense potentially isn't as strong, and yet again, they're peaking. You contrast that with the Bills, where it really is just Josh Allen, right? James Cook has had a fantastic year. I think he's actually probably the play in this contest, and yet you look at the group of receivers, I think it can be a positive or a negative that they are so deep, so balanced, they can beat you in so many ways, and yet it's also problematic that they don't have a star. They don't have go-to guys. Now, if Zay Flowers is out, then you end up in a situation where the two teams are very similar in terms of their receiving core, other than the fact that the Bills are just much, much deeper. So that flips back in their favor. And yet, if you're going to put it all on Josh Allen, you have to realize that that is what the game is about, that they're not that strong otherwise on offense, that their defense has been shredded multiple times recently. It has the feel of a shootout. Colm, a lot of people will point to the Bills' loss to Kansas City in that overtime game where they didn't touch the ball and say they didn't have control over that. But one of the things that you have to keep in mind is that the defense matters. And Lamar Jackson, in that same kind of context, is going to put a huge number of points on the board. They put up 35 the first time. If they need to, they can probably put up more the second time. And the game that stands out for the Bills, similar to the one that I just mentioned for the Ravens, was their home loss to the Cincinnati Bengals at home in the snow in the playoffs, where they don't show up at all and they get hammered. So it's not just this game against the Chiefs where there was some unfairness involved. Now, that doesn't mean that's going to happen again, but both of these teams have some real demons that they need to exercise. And just from a franchise perspective, these two quarterbacks have to prove that they are more than regular season MVP types of players. You got to come through and do it in the big moment. You know, from that perspective, we have teams on the NFC side like the Los Angeles Rams who have done that a little bit more. So it does seem like this is the season for the Bills or the Ravens, even though the Chiefs come in here as the two-time defending champions and the number one seed. But they have a lot to prove, and I think that's one of the reasons that this AFC playoff group is so fascinating, but also just so exciting when we talk about the 2024 playoffs.
Yeah, the other thing, you mentioned a good point about the game earlier this season, and both of these have been teams who have crushed teams at certain points of the season. And you mentioned then back to the Cincinnati game where they beat the Bills. I feel like that's a contest where it can get out of hand pretty quickly in either direction. If the Bills end up having, a 21-3 lead, entering halftime, or the other way around, I think that both teams may struggle in that kind of fight from behind mode based on how both are looking to operate. I am trying to work it out here as I look through it, but Shawn, I think there is only 5 of the 18 games this season where the Bills have scored less than 30 points. Now, they have a couple that are on the 30-point margin, but the game against they lost to Houston, they put up 20. They lost to Baltimore, they put up 10. They lost to the Patriots this week where they put up 16, and I'm counting that game and those figures. But, they've multiple 40-point plus games. They've multiple over 35, and then all the rest of them over 30. So they are a team that can do a lot of damage as well offensively. And I do think that that's a game that could skew one way or the other and have one of those wacky kind of score lines. Let's say it wasn't wacky, but the Vikings-Lions kind of scenario where it's like 31-9 come the end of the game this week. But yeah, both of those very interesting. The other team, Shawn, that we have to highlight is the Broncos. So Marvin Mims, another strong game this week. Bo Nix, strong game. I don't think Nix is going to be in the conversation for anyone really when we're moving into this. Any of the players you want to highlight as potential options? If you're thinking that it's a one and done here for the Broncos, that you think that could be a good addition to the roster, as Sutton, the Mims. Also, that Valley touchdown reception this week, I want to highlight. It was one of the funniest plays I've seen, where Nix goes on to break some rookie records with that play. But I think, Shawn, there may have been like 4 bobbles before somehow Valley makes the reception in the end zone. But outside of that, Shawn, any Broncos that you want to highlight?
Well, it probably comes down to Sutton and Mims, right? And you'd be tempted to go with Mims with the idea that, again, maybe the more sophisticated participants are going to be fading him off of the thought that a lot of other participants will be playing him. Then you go into the, he knows that I know that he knows that, etc. That part I think is interesting. You can also use them as a sneaky fade team, because if they do go out there and get annihilated as they did when they played at the Ravens earlier this year, because you don't have a real running back play, you don't have an interesting tight end play. If they can take out Courtland Sutton, then you're really looking at, does Marvin Mims have one of these weird plays to score? Now, having said that, I do like Mims in the situation. When we are thinking about the Broncos and who they are, you can't just say, when they started playing well, they were pretty good. But you have those 2 initial games for Bo Nix in somewhat difficult circumstances. From that point, they're 10-5. They have a blowout win over the Buccaneers. They do put up a lot of points in some of these situations. Most of their victories do come against bad teams, but they haven't been overmatched by the good teams either, except for that Ravens game. They had a very close loss to the Chiefs where they had the fluky blocked field goal at the end when they should have won at Kansas City. They lose a close game to the Chargers in week 16. They lose that thrilling game to the Bengals in week 17. The Chiefs probably are not as bad, even with their backups, as what that 38-0 score indicates. Denver is interesting, right? They have a lot of great defensive metrics, and yet you look at the Browns victory where Jerry Jeudy goes off against them, and you're thinking, okay, this is a team you can score against, even with that defense showing some numbers. It's a defense that the Ravens put up 41 against. Probably the Bills will still have their way with them. But don't be surprised if Denver fights back. I think that in terms of expectation and outcome, the Broncos are the team that's most likely to pull a big upset this weekend. And that would really throw everything into chaos. It certainly would give the Baltimore Ravens an easier path than to the Super Bowl.
Oh, it certainly would. Mims, Shawn, again, I think a player who, like we've talked a lot in the podcast, but I think general public or people playing maybe in some of these contests, or even if you're drafting in a different format, people mightn't be as interested in him based on, what he had done throughout his career so far, even through that kind of midpoint of the season. But in recent weeks, he had 5 targets this previous week, 8 before that, 5 before that, 4, 4, 5. He's starting to get involved a lot more in the offense. Now, he did have back-to-back 2 touchdown games, so that skews it a bit. But he also had the 103 yards against Cincinnati, he had 105 yards against Cleveland, a touchdown in that game as well. So he is becoming more and more involved in the offense, and he's been used in a multitude of ways. I know, Shawn, when we were talking about him originally, with the potential, they were starting to use him a little bit more. You were quite early on maybe they kind of move him into a kind of a Deebo Samuel style role from previous season, but he's been used in a lot of different ways, and it's becoming very effective part of their offense. So even if it's a game where the Bills have a 20-point lead, you're probably not in that situation going to get the deep touchdown, but you will get maybe some of that underneath work and a lot of touches going the way of Mims, particularly if it's a situation where Cortland Sutton maybe has been bottled up a little bit. So I do think that he's an interesting play for the Broncos. Kansas City Chiefs, Shawn, you obviously have the kind of historical candidates for a contest like this in Patrick Mahomes, Travis Kelce, obviously Xavier Worthy, one of our personal favorites. But who are you looking at when you're lining up your Chiefs pick? Because obviously they're likely here to make it to the AFC Championship game, and then obviously one step away from those double points in the Super Bowl at that particular moment in time.
It's got to be Xavier Worthy, right? We
played only one answer, Shawn. It's the correct answer.
Xavier Worthy all season. I mean, Travis Kelce is the default tight end. He has been hotter recently.
I think that is an interesting point to make. We've talked a lot about all the different players. We've highlighted some tight ends, but you have Laporta, but do you want to give up on Gibbs? Looking through all the other rosters, and then you have Mark Andrews. You have even, like we talked about, likely somebody could go that direction. Kincaid is obviously an option, but hasn't been clicking with Josh Allen. But then you get down to the default options can be Travis Kelce, which could lead to him coming in at just a gigantic roster number when it comes to the overall field here. So the answer is Xavier Worthy. But the question then becomes, Shawn, you got to
play a tight end. You got to play.
We're back to Zach Ertz from show one. We're back. Zach Ertz is the tight end.
I mean, usually in this contest, you have 3 or 4 interesting guys. And your question is, do I want to play 2 or even 3 tight ends to take advantage of that tight end premium? You think about what tight end premium has done for our teams throughout the season. One of the things that Ben and I focused on in last week's Seedling Bananas, which a lot of people have replied to and said they really enjoyed that show. A little bit of a recap, a wrap up, but also a look forward. How do you win in the future? How do you resist fighting the last war and get ready for the next fantasy year? You think about those elite tight ends, but this playoff group doesn't really have them in a way that you want to deploy them. So if you're not going to play Kelce, you've got to figure out another guy. We talked about playing Jordan Addison with the idea that the Vikings might actually be a very flat team that quickly goes out. The other option there would very clearly be TJ Hawkinson. Addison probably a lot lower rostered than Hawkinson when you think about the way that fantasy managers have to force a tight end into that group. And so you end up with a less exciting play in Hawkinson than Addison, and you end up with one that is on more teams. So those things aren't favorable for you. It's a little bit of a question of, do you think Xavier Worthy actually can go off for multiple weeks? Do you think that he can score well enough if the Chiefs make the Super Bowl? Colm, if Kansas City does win and is the three-peat team, who do you like off of them in that scenario?
I think that with what we've seen with Worthy in recent weeks and how he's been used, and again, I keep going back to the deep shots haven't worked out, but again, they haven't worked out until now. They very may well work out here in one of these playoff games or even in the Super Bowl, but they are using him in a multitude of ways, a bit like we touched there with Mims and how they're trying to get him the ball in different scenarios. They're getting the ball in his hands and he's getting 5 receptions, 8 receptions or so a game and then getting in the end zone. So I think that it has to be him. Kelce is obviously going to be heavily rostered and has had some very big games here towards the end of the season, which people will have fresh in their memory. But I think when you take the roster percentages and that in, that Worthy makes a lot of sense. I do still think there'll be people that'll go towards Patrick Mahomes, but it has been very difficult for anyone who's rostered Mahomes in fantasy over the last kind of 12 to 18 months. The consistency with the high upside scoring isn't there. But if you get him to the Super Bowl and it's a 3 touchdown game, again, that would be very valuable if people go that direction. But Worthy would be my preferred pick out of the Chiefs. I think the secondary option would have to be that default to Kelsey at tight end. The one thing with the contest, Shawn, I think people, if they haven't played in it before, even if they have played in it before, we've been talking through it here for, an hour between both shows, but you start to get into that situation of like, oh, I really like that player at quarterback, like that player at running back. I joked with you when we finished the first show, Gibbs at running back and Daniels at quarterback, and get Daniels to the championship game, and then you get Gibbs in the Super Bowl, and you start to work through all that, and then you get to the end and you've like one space left and you're like, it's Kansas City Chiefs, and you're like, well, I've no tight end yet, what to like. And once you go to change and you're like, well, I want to have Worthy in there, so then you have to go back and you have to work out which team are you taking one of the players you've already picked to put on their tight end into the tight end spot. It's a lot of fun. It can also be very can be very challenging, but it's a lot of fun trying to work out those players and those picks that you want to have. And as I mentioned, there is the $35 level, the $200 level. A lot of fun over at myffpc.com for the playoff challenge. Me and Shawn will be doing number of teams in there, hoping to take down the prizes. But Shawn, as we get ready to close things out here, I guess we'll have to give our pick for the Super Bowl and the Super Bowl winner. But any final playoff challenge notes?
Just a great contest. We have so much fun with it. Get in there. We want an OT community victor in the $500,000 prize. Bring home that title.
Now we get to the fun part. Super Bowl champion, Shawn. We'll get I have gone on the show and said I think it's going to be the Bills and the Lions based on my projections here. What do I want to happen? I want the Packers to win the Super Bowl. It's a long road from the 7th seed to go and do that. Shawn, I think we're looking at Bills Lions with a Lions Super Bowl win this year. Tell me what your prediction is.
I think we get Patrick Mahomes leading the game-winning drive deep in overtime against the Baltimore Ravens to make it to another Super Bowl. And then the magic finally ends as they get blown out by the Detroit Lions in this year's Super Bowl. Colm, those are my two favorite teams, so I'm obviously going to take them as the number one seeds. I think the playoffs for what has been a magical 2024 season are going to be some of the best yet. Good luck to everyone and to all the fan bases. Let's spread those Super Bowls around. Get one for Detroit.
It's great that like the Chiefs are now in a situation where they've won so many that Shawn can pass it on to his other favorite team and just share the Super Bowls around, because we have so many we can share them. But yeah,
I still remember going to a Silverdome game back as a little kid, although that may have been a USFL game. Colm, back in the USFL, the real USFL days. Anyway.
Shawn going down memory lane. We are going to see who wins it all and who wins the FFPC Playoff Challenge. But it is, I'm excited, Shawn, for the playoffs. It's just a different feeling when it's, all on the line every week as we work our way through the playoffs here in the wildcard weekend this weekend. We'll be back later in the week with another show. Make sure you're subscribed to the RotoViz Overtime podcast feed to get all those once they are available. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter or Blue Sky at Overtime Ireland. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out all of Shawn's work up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.